Good morning, good evening, gentle viewers, wherever you might be around the world or the nation that you find yourself in. Welcome back to our weekly installment of Commander Culture TV. We are here with Templar, and we're here with Miss Sherry Chrétien. Talking today, we're taking a little bit of a break from our examination of the sort of culture war that we've been talking about the last couple of days and how we all fit into it as individuals and as a culture, a society, to look at the Ukraine issue that has blown up. The trucker convoy thing kind of came and went before we had a chance to really dig our teeth into it. Although it's still going on in America, from what I've heard. This Ukraine thing, though, is a much bigger issue, and it needs to be understood in context. At least we three here believe that our audience needs to understand our perspective on it, and we look forward to any kind of conversation that can be generated from that, because it's very, 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 very important to understand the battle that's now openly being waged. We did have Canada almost descend into a civil war, and now we have a brothers' war going on in Eastern Europe. And to understand that is to understand the fight that we are currently in. Culture wars sometimes have military components to them, and so that's what we'll be looking at today. Templar, welcome to the broadcast.
Yep, thank you for having me as always. And I know the whole Ukraine-Russia issue has kind of been in the back of your head for some decades now, from what it sounds like. So we'll see if we can't go through there. And I think not just kind of parsing the facts in this issue, because there's a lot of non-facts floating around, which is, I mean, it's always been the case, but it's never been, from what I could tell, as egregious and pervasive as in this instance. It's almost as if the information war is what's really the real war, and then what's going on the ground is almost a sideshow. And so we'll see if we can't parse some of those facts. And then also parsing the belligerents, because it's almost as if Russia and Ukraine as countries are proxies themselves for potentially larger issues. Obviously, Ukraine being a puppet for the globalist American empire, but that's almost synonymous with the UN, just the new world order in general. EU tied with US to form this, and NATO as well. All of these things
World
are
Economic Forum.
synonymous. Yes.
All of these
synonymous entities that exist on a global scale that are on one side, with Ukraine, and then there's kind of Russia and everyone else who's not part of this globalist amalgamation on the other. Not that China is necessarily getting involved, but it's really the Western globalists versus whoever exists in opposition to them. So that's another way of contextualizing this. But historically speaking, this has been a long time coming, as you recognize, and we'll kind of try to cut through some of the BS and see who the different supporters and detractors are on either side. We named our belligerents, so we'll see what do the leftists think, what do the people on the right think, and it's kind of interesting how these battle lines have been drawn ideologically, and it's worth kind of clarifying who's on what side and for what reason, so that the viewer can kind of make their own informed decision on their stance. And then hopefully by the end of this, everybody is on the side of what is true and what is just. So it's going to be a good one.
Thank you. Looking forward to it. Ms. Cherie?
I'm always happy to be here and get my 2 cents in with the, information war that we have going on.
Mm-hmm. And I want to thank you for aggregating the memes that we'll be looking at today in the backdrop of our conversation. It's always nice to have a fun visual. So we do appreciate that assistance that you have lent to the channel. So what we have here going across the bottom, and as I speak, because even though it's CCTV, this is also Templar's platform, and anything that I say that differs from what you think, this is something that we want to talk about, or Cherie for that matter, because that whatever you're thinking is what other people out there are thinking as well. I've heard a lot of stuff in the mainstream press. We can see here on this meme, or in this cartoon, the narrative versus the reality. And when I posted a few things, very mild posts pointing out basically the history and the geopolitics surrounding this issue on my personal social medias, a lot of people got in contact with me. It really surprised me, actually, from all corners and walks of life and from my past, who were like, I really agree with you, but I can't say what you're saying here. And so that's when I determined to myself, I've got to come on and say something on the channel here. As I was telling Templar in the pre-broadcast, I've worked through 3 different monologues to try to come up with an actual video, a short video, and I just couldn't. Either the events overtook it, or it wasn't enough to encompass my thoughts. And so here we are on another live broadcast. We have this idea that's floating around through the mainstream media that Putin is an aggressor, that Putin is crazy. And in fact, I'm going to walk that back a little bit. Like this cartoon, I don't use the word Putin. I don't know much about Putin except what one can read in the paper. And what we're talking about here is not one man. They want you to think it's one man because the globalist American empire wants you to think that this is a reincarnation of Hitler, and since Hitler bad, all of this bad. But what we're dealing with here is the realpolitik, to use a 19th century phrase, of Russia attempting to defend its national interests versus the globalist American empire trying to crush any sort of nationalist revanchism that's anywhere on planet Earth. And so we see encapsulated in this cartoon the narrative, which says that this hapless goof is being attacked by a rabid bear, and we need to pray for Ukraine. Then we see the reality where Russia is not even leaving its cave, and NATO, Britain, the US, the World Economic Forum, the European Union, and all of these other cretins are sending hapless peasants whose leadership has been corrupted and bought off via money and military coup type means into the mouth of this particular bear in order to get the bear to respond in a way that fits with the narrative that the US, NATO, and Britain have, which is that Russia is aggressive. Russia is not aggressive. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russians have made, I believe, four distinct military moves. 2 in Chechnya, when the Soviet Union just fell, and the CIA and the United States paid Muslim terrorists to take over a former Soviet republic and attempt to penetrate what was Russia. The Russians won, and in that second event, the person who won that for the Russians was Putin, and this led to his rise to power and as the sort of savior of Russia. Then when Georgia, the country of Georgia to the south of Russia, was threatening to be admitted to NATO, the Russians moved in and disrupted the attempt to become a NATO country through a very limited military intervention. Then in 2014, in response to the coup of the basically neutral leaning pro-Russia government in Ukraine that led to the globalist American empires and the Biden crime family and the Obama State Department's direct control of the Ukrainian government, the Russians moved in specifically to take Crimea, which was an area that the Russians needed for their national security, especially for their Black Sea Fleet, and which the Ukrainian government, going back to the beginning of Ukraine as an independent country, had guaranteed to access to Russia. And now, of course, because they were a CIA puppet, a Biden crime family puppet, they were doing their bidding and trying to poke Russia with that little tiny spear, right? So Putin, Russia is not the aggressor in this particular situation. NATO and the countries that make up NATO, the governments that make up NATO, are the aggressors. When we've seen this before, and we'll go into the history of this later, but I want to make that perfectly clear. The attempt is to get Russia to overstep and then get the government to collapse from the inside via a color revolution, like the kind that they had in Ukraine before, like the kind that they tried to spark in Kazakhstan and Belarus this last year, and like the color revolution that saw the current occupant of the White House steal the election from Donald Trump. They have one playbook, and that's all that they have. They like to throw meat shields into meat grinders, and this is what this graphic is basically showing.
Yeah, and I would like to say to your part on Russia being the aggressor. Some people might hear that and roll their eyes and be like, "What are you talking about? This has been the way of the world for however many years, and now Russia's just invading countries out of nowhere." And I guess the equivalent from a U.S. perspective would be, if Russia or China were putting missiles in Mexico or Canada that could obviously hit us very close, we wouldn't tolerate that. And in fact, we have a real life case study, and that's when the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, and we used military force to prevent Russia from staging armaments in vicinity of our sphere of influence, specifically the U.S. Sphere of influence there. So it's not irrational, it's not unreasonable, it's not unprecedented, and it's not something that the very people who are accusing Russia of doing have not done themselves. So I would just like to point that out there, because even though we haven't necessarily seen conventional armed conflict occurring in the 21st century very often, it has its equivalents in every way, shape, and form, other than maybe specifically boots on the ground. And again, the people accusing them of being aggressors really don't have a moral high ground to stand on.
No, Russia has been the victim of an economic war for the past 25 years, since the Western puppet Yeltsin died from drinking himself to death. Russia has been the victim of a cultural war that's been waged against it, a propaganda war, a cyber war, and they've attempted to get Russia, into a conflict for a really, really long time. If Russia was an aggressive power, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia would not exist. Poland would likely not exist. In fact, I will make the claim, and people can rebut it if they want, that if the Russians wanted to, they could drive all the way to Paris, minus the consideration of nuclear weapons, because of the sad, pathetic, weakened state of European militaries and their American client. There's really not much that would stop them. And people can say, well, look, they're barely taking ground in Ukraine. The ground war in Ukraine is proceeding faster than the ground war did in Iraq in the early 1990s, the first Gulf War. I mean, it is lightning fast in an area that has lots of civilian populations, cities, industries, things that weren't present in Iraq in 1991. And the civilian casualties, from what I'm seeing, are extremely low. The Russians have no desire to take over all of Ukraine, and they never had. It would be absolute folly, although they may have to, depending on how the globalist American empire decides to play what hand it has. And it's worth pointing out, when I say the globalist American empire, we're not talking about whoever is occupying the White House. There's nobody's in charge of the White House. Well, at least nobody that we know, right? And that's a very scary situation that I think we might have pointed out last week. And at least in Russia, we know that there is somebody in charge. And by them saying that he's crazy, that's just projection. We have a schizophrenic bunch of geriatric lunatics who are hell-bent on making sure that they don't lose at any cost, which is a very dangerous sort of situation. And people have asked, well, why is why is Putin threatening nuclear war? And it's like, he's not really threatening nuclear war. He's saying, you guys can't intervene in our particular situation. That's like saying, why did Kennedy threaten nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis? He made a clear line that said that this cannot be passed. And the other side took it at his word, because the other side actually had someone on their side. He was sitting across from Khrushchev. Right now, Putin's sitting across from nobody at all. And they're all scrambling around behind the scenes, which is either a very good sign or a very bad sign, depending on how you look at it. Mr. Brown has joined the chat. Good morning. Biden, or whoever pulls his strings, did indeed get his war. But we can hope that this will be still a limited war. Regardless of what you think of the right or wrongness of the Russians versus the other people who aren't Russians and who hate Russians and want Western civilization to die, in a deluge of gay pride parades, the people that are running the show are not the people that we're told are running the show. And I personally don't think anyone's running the show. They want casualties, mass casualties. They want a forever war like they have in Syria down there at the bottom of the map. And so they'll just keep false flagging attacks on civilians. They'll keep trying to sabotage their own nuclear power plants. They'll keep making up all kinds of insane propaganda while the Russians simply secure the areas that they need in order to effect a ceasefire or a solution that ends the bloodshed, which is what we want. We want
yes. We want peace. We want people to stop killing each other in Ukraine. And it's the wildest thing, the kind of bloodlust that you are seeing from those on the other side. And it's hard to even describe what the sides are specifically. Who's us and who's them. We say we named at least the whole globalist American empire types, but I would say who's also on our side is anyone who's pro-white, and they're not necessarily rooting for Russia or Ukraine, but they're just in the no more brother wars camp of, why are we spilling our own blood on our own countries for people who really either are indifferent towards us or explicitly hate us. And so that's one camp to be in. But again, can you go ahead and define, are there belligerents other than the globalist American empire and Putin? I mean, I think people have been surprised on where the battle lines have been drawn, because it's not as clear cut as you see with like COVID or something.
Do we want to jump to your slide real quick to address that?
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning, because so long as we're talking about the conflict, we need to know where we stand and sort of who's with us and who's against us. Sort of thing.
I want to get back to the historical context here that we see in front of us on this particular map. Mm-hmm. But before that, like you said, let's go ahead and look at this very clever cartoon, which looks at the ideological lines. For a lot of different reasons, we see, and so I'll break it down for people who aren't familiar with what's happening here. You've got Russia in a tug of war, and Russia notices who's jumping in on his own side, but you have basically the extreme right, symbolized by fascists, and the extreme left, which is symbolized by communists, pulling for Russia. Okay, interesting. Well, who's pulling on the other side? On this side, you have the globalist American empire. You have Nazis as distinct from fascists or the extreme right, and you have Ukraine pulling on the other side, or you can see these other two powers actually pulling for them. The reference to Nazis is a reference to the historical roots of the paramilitary controllers of the current Ukraine government, who have their roots in the anti-communist, anti-Russian resistance during World War II, who were armed and supported by Hitler's legions. Yeah. And so
those people are basically like, not that they're LARPing from the past, but they, any prescribed self-acclaimed Nazi of today is like, oh, these are my people, these are my guys. They were against the Russians and with the Nazis in World War II. There's a bunch of paramilitary Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion who still exist in Ukraine today, and there's a lot of like goose-stepping, LARPing Ukrainians in specifically the western part of the country. And it's unfortunate because you see in that slide, it's like, well, what are they doing on the same side as the globalist American empire? And it's almost kind of the disparity between like the population writ large and then the people who control the government. Similarly, in America, you have an American population and an American government or an American regime that actually seem to be at odds with each other. Just like in Canada, you have the truckers versus the government. In America, you have things that are similar. A nation that exists under the umbrella of a not a puppet or a client state, but basically a government that hates them. And so you're seeing that here, where there's the Ukraine, is on that side, and then you've got the people themselves. A lot of would maybe be more sympathetic towards Nazis than the globalist American empire. Yet the globalist American empire is still pulling for Ukraine because they are essentially pulling the strings of Ukraine. They're functionally indistinguishable. Ukraine is a branch of the globalist American empire.
Right. It has become so since the Maidan coup was successful in 2014.
Yes, it was not always that way.
Correct. And this is why. So going back to some historical context, well, before that, I want to point out something that you were mentioning. People, I've seen this from people who I had in the past considered sober, rational observers of geopolitics and, the culture war, saying, by God, Russia has invaded a sovereign, democratic country, and that cannot stand. Ukraine is neither sovereign nor democratic. When a government is installed via coup, it is an illegitimate government. Ukraine, for most of its post-Cold War history, was some would call it a puppet of Russia. Others would call it a friendly country next to Russia. And at other times, it was kind of playing both sides, which countries tend to do. But it was never openly hostile to Russia. And so what we see here in Canada, in the United States, in Ukraine, are countries whose governments do not represent the full sovereign will of the individuals that are there. That means that those are not sovereign countries. They're under the control of something else. What we see in Russia, for example, whatever Russia is, it is a country where the majority of the people support the majority of the government. And one of the things we know as Americans, or as people who care about the tradition of democracy, is that a government is only legitimate if it is recognized and supported by the people that it governs, right? And that defines the Russian government. The Russian government has the support of the people. That's why the Russian government is under attack by countries that have had like a brain slug attached to them, like the United States, like Great Britain, like Germany, like the Baltic states, and like Ukraine. To say the interests of our individual citizens are not the interests of our government, and the interests of our government are supreme, and that's what they say. And so any country that resists that, whether it's a sort of nationalist, revanchist type country like Russia, whether it is a small pastoral country like Hungary, whether it is a like sort of an independent maverick country like Bolivia, or whether it's a communist tyrannical dictatorship like China, is under the target of this particular cabal of brain slug infected countries that we call the globalist American empire.
Mm-hmm. And so yeah, I would just like to point out that so you see the belligerents here, like you already alluded to. There's the right wing and the communists, and then the globalist American empire and the Nazis. And the communists and the Nazis are basically just like reliving World War II and exist in opposition to each other only because the other one exists. Like they wouldn't care if the context of World War II didn't exist. But any self-ascribed communist is saying, "Oh, the USSR, they're rising up again. This is great. Like, yes, let's sweep away the fascist Western governments." And then the quote unquote Nazis on the Ukrainian side are like, "Oh, well, they backed us before. They'll back us again." They're basically just living out the World War II context, but those rules simply don't apply anymore. That's just not what the political and ideological lines on the ground reflect,
Mm-hmm.
or specifically in the governments reflect. And so that's where I would argue the most realistic portrayal is represented by the hard right, or quote unquote fascist shirt here, and the globalist American empire. Those are the ones who are genuinely at odds with each other in this instance, and are really in a fight for their lives, because you have American first types, kind of representing the American people in America. And again, when I say America, in the globalist American empire, it's really just in the context of like a globalist system. And so the people in America who have the biggest dog in the fight and the greatest influence over the globalist American empire, they're the ones that are resisting it, and they see this war drawn on those lines where Russia exists outside of the globalist American empire, and so any encroachment on the or in the power, in the sphere of influence of the globalist American empire, doesn't matter if it's China, doesn't matter if it's Russia, doesn't matter who it is, but anything that embarrasses, weakens, basically just consolidates the globalist American empire power and sphere of influence is a good thing. And so they're not necessarily saying, "Hey, I love Russia, I'm super pro-Russian," or "I love China, I'm super pro-Chinese." It's just more of along the lines of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And in this instance, it happens to be Russia basically fighting this war against the globalist American system, or a UN, or a NATO, or whatever you want to. Again, all those things are the same. And they see Russia fighting against those things, and so they happen to be on the same side as Russia. Uh, and I would actually tend to agree with them that anything that reduces the power or influence of this regime, this evil globalist empire, is a good thing. And so I might not necessarily think that Putin or the Russian government are the saviors of humanity, or even the Chinese. In fact, I find most of Chinese politics and their influence to be a negative, but I would take their influence over that of the evil regime that currently exists in Washington and in Belgium at the head of the UN. So I think that's probably just a little more elaboration there on the rainbow shirt there that you see, and the fascist T-shirt. And then the last thing I would say is, we keep talking about whoever's in power, whoever's in charge. When you have the Rothschilds, George Soros, and the State Department all unanimously preaching their support for Ukraine, you could be pretty confident that if you take the stance of whatever exists opposite to that you will be in the right. So you can pretty much end your thought exercise there. Just do the opposite of what these evil people are doing, and you're probably on the quote unquote right side of history, as much as they wouldn't want you to believe.
Well, that's a very good point to make. And ever more nowadays, I think. I mean, this is how I guide a lot of my thinking. Is I simply look at who my declared enemies are, and see who those declared enemies are attacking, and then decide not to join the side of my declared enemies against those random neutral parties. Mm-hmm. In this particular case, Russia is a random neutral party. You guys may have heard of a boxer named Muhammad Ali, right? Muhammad Ali was famous for a lot of things, including his refusal to be drafted for the Vietnamese War. And when people said, "Why aren't you a patriotic American?" and he replied with, "Listen, no Vietnamese ever called me the N-word." And when I look at this particular situation with Russia, people say, "Don't you hate Russia?" And I say, no Russian ever called me a
domestic terrorist.
cisgender breeder, domestic terrorist, Nazi. And so the people who do call me that are by definition my enemies, my sworn enemies. And if they're distracted fighting somebody else, I might think twice about the merits of that other person's particular case. So let's step back to the merits of this particular case. NATO, I will go over it really quick because I don't want to bore anyone, but I think that the context and the history is important. NATO was an organization that was created in 1949 against the will of the USSR, who wanted to keep Germany sort of a neutral country, and who did not want the United States interfering with European collective security. We can guess at their reasons. But what the United States did do is it co-opted a collective security agreement of UK and France and a couple of other ancillary European nations, and then brought the West Germans in. When this happened, the Russians, the Soviets, responded by creating the Warsaw Pact. You have NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and they were facing off of each other for the whole entire Cold War, and everyone thought it was going to go hot, and there was all kinds of great war games and movies and stuff made about it. But then at the end of the day, the Soviet Union collapsed. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a very, very large fear that the generals in charge of the Soviet Union, who really had a lot of power, would stage a military coup, which in fact they did, and then say, well, it's now or never. We might as well invade the West since we have this power. And in that coup, they failed to ignite the passions of the Russian people, and the coup failed. But it was clear that the Soviet Union was going to fall apart. And so the leadership, the faltering leadership of the USSR, went to meet with the leaders of the West and said, we're about to fall apart. We're about to devolve all of our individual Soviet republics like Ukraine and Lithuania and Belarus and Kazakhstan and Georgia, and give up the ghost. But what we don't want is we don't want NATO to expand closer to our borders. Now that we're no longer here, NATO should no longer exist. And the leaders of the West said, yes, absolutely, we completely agree. And they signed agreements and made statements to the leaders of Russia that NATO would not expand beyond its 1990 borders. And so the Soviet Union devolved. It gave freedom to its various Soviet republics, which I want to point out for those of you that weren't there in 1990, 1991 when this was happening. This was in the context of a world where we had just seen an attempt at democracy in China brutally put down by tanks and machine guns in Tiananmen Square. And there was no reason whatsoever to think that the Russians, who were our absolute bitter enemies, whereas the Chinese at that time were more or less our pet, was that the Russians were going to react any less severely. But in fact, they did not. There was almost no bloodshed in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They let Estonia go. They let Ukraine walk away with their nuclear weapons. They let Georgia and Kazakhstan and all these countries walk away peacefully because they were given guarantees that NATO would not expand. NATO would not expand. NATO would not expand. And so Russia became Russia, and all of this, and the Soviet Union fell apart. And then, as we see, NATO, the EU, the nascent World Economic Forum, these other groups started scheming. And in 1999, as we can see on this map, and then later in 2004, and then later in 2009, started expanding NATO membership to the borders of Russia. In fact, Estonia and Latvia actually touched the borders of Russia. And Russia said, this is an extreme threat. We no longer have a Warsaw Pact. We no longer have a military alliance against any of these countries. We have no desire to invade them. If we did, we would have done so. All we desire to do is sell our plentiful and excess oil to these countries. Why would we invade somebody and have to control a bunch of pissed off millions of people when we could sell oil to people at cheaper than the Arabs can, cheaper than the Americans can? Remember that thought, boys and girls. And then have millions of happy customers. It doesn't make any sense. And just as it doesn't make any sense today. But that didn't matter to the globalist American empire. They gaily expanded NATO to the borders of Russia. As I mentioned, they tried to expand it to Ukraine and to Georgia, and Russia said that's completely unacceptable. And so that is what we are looking at. We're looking at a country that wanted to mind its own business, being constantly from 1990 to 1999 to 2004 to 2009 to 2014 to 2021 to 2022, being poked, prodded, attacked by economic and cultural means again and again and again and again and again, and saying, this is our red line, this is our red line, this is our red line. You cannot interfere with Ukraine. And then they did. And then they were attacked. So you tell me, if you're sitting in a classroom, right, and there's a big, huge, hulking boy in the back of the room who's always sulking and looking down and's got greasy hair and mumbles and doesn't say anything, but just sits in the back of the classroom, and the class clown gets up and from 7th grade until 12th grade pokes the kid in the ear, pokes the kid in the eye, goes over, dances around him, says funny songs that gets the whole rest of the class laughing at him, steals his pencils, does all of this kind of stuff. And by 12th grade, the year 2022, finally that boy just stands up and knocks that little pencil-necked geek the F out. Are you going to say, oh my God, he's so rude, he knocked out that little kid who never did anything to him? Okay? That's the situation that we have here. That's exactly the situation. Or you could say that class clown got a little tiny shrimp kid and put him up and got him punched out, and that's what we have in Ukraine. That's why this fight has to end tomorrow. And it can't end with a Ukrainian victory. It can't. Ukraine doesn't have the forces. It doesn't have the wherewithal. Ukraine is not a sovereign independent country. It's a satrapy of the European Union and the World Bank. It has no export. It has no national gross domestic product. And that's what I'm trying to say. All it has are bad loans that keep floating into it because it is a failed state. And when you have something like that, that's not a situation where you can have a military success that arises from that. What you can have is Russia meeting its goals that it stated, which is to have a demilitarized Ukraine, a Ukraine that does not join NATO, referendums in Ukraine for people who want to join Russia because it's more economically successful than the basket case that is Ukraine. And that's the only way that we can possibly win. We, meaning the sane people of the world. Now, whether that's right or wrong, everyone has their own opinion, but that's the only way that we can win without millions and millions of people being killed, which is what the people who are saying pray for Ukraine want. Mm-hmm. Not the idiots on Facebook, not the morons that are like, I stand with Ukraine, I'm sending diapers there, even though there's no address, and if it's a war zone, how is mail going to get there? It's not those kind of morons. It's the morons who tell them pray for Ukraine. It's the people who create those little things to put on their Facebook page that are telling them what to think. They're saying, I want bloodshed in Ukraine. I want all of those people to die. It fulfills my stupid fantasy that I received from the propaganda organs on TV that says that Putin man bad, and pray for Ukraine, and that good guy versus bad guy, and I'm too stupid to find Ukraine on a map. This kind of stuff pisses me off because they did it in Syria. Syria is still in a state of civil war, right? Iraq is still in a period of low-level civil war. These are two countries that had massive Christian populations, most of whom are either dead or exiled. Ukraine is a Christian country. It's a European country. It should be stable. It should be peaceful. It should be secure. But instead, we have these satanic jackasses running around dancing in the blood of all of these people. And we can see on this map, if you can't see on this map why Russia is not the bad guy, I can't help you. I cannot help you. If you don't see how encircling a sovereign and independent country, which Russia is, with military arms again and again and again. Let me tell you people something. There's a man by the name of George Kennan. George Kennan is one of America's. He's the greatest American diplomat of the 20th century. Forget Kissinger. Okay, he was just a goofball. George Kennan was the man who came up with the policy of containment, who said to the Eisenhower and to Truman, he said, this is how we have to deal with the Soviet problem. We have to put military bases on all of their borders. We have to make sure that their trade routes are contained. We have to make sure that they don't spread communism to other places. This is where the domino theory later came from. And George Kennan, by the way, old man that he was still alive in 1991. He was still alive in 1998 when they were talking about expanding NATO to the borders. And they said, well, what do you think about this, George Kennan? And he said, this is the stupidest thing you could possibly imagine. He said, do you idiots have any idea what you're doing? The Russians overcame their brutal oppressor called the Soviet Union, overthrew it in one of the most bloodless transformations of massive tyrannical power into a democracy in human history, and then came with their hat in their hand to the Americans who they looked up to and wanted to watch David Hasselhoff concerts from morning until night, and eat McDonald's in Red Square, and that's all they ever wanted. And they said, "Please help us." And how were they repaid with that? Their country was looted. Their oligarchs were bought off. Their infrastructure was left to rot. Their people were hung out to dry. And in addition to all of that, their political structure was co-opted and corrupted under Yeltsin. And in addition to all of that, they started expanding military bases on all of their borders. That's insane. That is such insane, stupid provocation of going back 30 years that it's a miracle that Russia hasn't lashed out before. It's a miracle that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania still exist as independent countries. The only reason they do is because Russia has no interest in external foreign territory whatsoever. They're okay with NATO putting a rinky-dink, idiot, weak, stupid battalion of APCs or something on their border, a wing of F-16s flying out of Estonia. They don't care about that. They want world peace. Otherwise, they would have taken those fool countries out when they tried to join NATO, right? NATO, by the way, which is only using those small countries as a tripwire to bait Russia. That's what they wanted in 2004. That's what they want now in Ukraine in 2022. That's the entire sweep of globalist American empire diplomatic geopolitics. How can we bait Russia? How can we bait Russia? How can we destroy Russia? How can we minimize Russia? And that's all it is. It's this insane obsession with destroying this country that has never done anything to the United States. The last time Russia did anything to the United States, they sold us Alaska. You know, Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia was a prisoner of the Soviet Union. And if you don't understand how Russia was just as much a prisoner of the Soviet Union as Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, Georgia, go look at the death tolls. How many Russians died under the Soviets' yoke? Okay? And when they were finally freed, now they are, have the slaver that is the globalist American empire, kleptocracy, bankster kleptocracy coming after them. I mean, I am on a rant, but this kind of thing just, it is so unjust. It is so damn unjust. You know, and I mean,
I would like to clarify that the reason why the GAE wants Russia destroyed is because they don't control it. They obviously, Putin's in control, like we said before, of their country. It is not necessarily some puppet that they can, rape and pillage the country like they can everywhere else in the West.
The Russians don't put up with shit. There's another group of people who don't put up with shit down there.
Chinese.
I'm looking in Europe.
People do,
I'm going to say the Serbians. Okay. Now, and the Serbians are a Slavic people. They're an Orthodox Christian people. They simply do not put up with shit. If you want to know why World War I started, one of the big reasons is because somebody tried to give shit to a Serbian. They simply do not take shit. Well, in 1998 and 99, the United States decided they didn't like the way Serbia was acting. The fact that Serbia is like a mini Russia and is seen as a protectorate of Russia back then and now meant that they could poke Russia in the eye by kicking Serbia's ass. So what did Bill Clinton do? He went and kicked Serbia's ass. What was Serbia's big crime? It was protecting itself from Muslim terrorists. Okay, that was their big crime. I sat there and I watched the United States, the beacon of freedom and democracy, blow the shit out of the Serbians. who had never done anything to the United States except fight with them in World War I, fight with them in World War II, including saving thousands of American pilots who crash landed there after bombing Germany. And then we decided we're going to just blow the living crap out of these people because Russia happens to like them. And Russia was like, I swear to you guys, you cannot do this. This is one reason that Yeltsin fell from power and one reason that Putin was able to rise to power, because Russia did nothing while Serbia was crushed and had a huge chunk of its territory, which is now called Kosovo, which is another fake country, much more fake than Ukraine, wrenched out from its southern border. And I sat there and I watched that. It was what you may not know about me personally. I was training to be a U.S. Army officer, and I expressed displeasure in the way that I'm expressing displeasure now with this stupid, idiotic, brutalist American policy in Serbia. And they said, you can't think that way if you're going to be a military officer. And I said, well, then you can take these stripes and you can shove them up your butt. And I walked away from a very good career, or what would have been a very promising career, because those psychos, even back in 1998, before they had even extended NATO, were looking to poke Russia in the eye. It just makes me sick. I'm gonna move on because I don't want to sound monomaniacal. What is Ukraine? Ukraine, as we pointed out, is a failed state. It is not a democracy. It is not really even sovereign. There are Ukrainian people, and we can see in this map that the Ukrainian people are that have a core territory that has always existed, and then they have a much larger territory here in yellow that has existed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, which could easily be called the heartland of Ukraine. But what is currently called Ukraine is nothing of the sort. The area that's green was stolen from Poland in 1945. Every single little smidgen of land there that you see in 1945, that's not Ukrainian. That's Polish. That city's not even called Lviv. It's called Lvov with an O. Ukrainians come in and they change the names of everything. And that's just the way they do things. Joseph Stalin said, well, I wouldn't want Poland to be too strong, so I'm just going to take a whole bunch of their territory. Where can I attach it to? Well, Ukraine's the furthest west, so we'll go ahead and attach it there. Great. Okay, so then along comes, Nikita Khrushchev, and he adds Crimea, which has been an integral part of Ukraine for all of history, according to all the people in 2014 when Russia invaded there, which, of course, it was not. Nikita Khrushchev himself was a Ukrainian, so it was kind of a vanity project, adding that lucrative, rich, strategically important territory to Ukraine by administrative fiat. Same thing that Vladimir Lenin did in 1922. All of the territory where the disagreements were, the Donbass region in the east, that's not Ukrainian territory. Those are not Ukrainian people. Those are Russian people, right? That were being victimized at first by the economic incompetence of the Ukrainians, and then by the illegal and illegitimate government of Ukraine that came in by coup in 2014 and decided to specifically and intentionally victimize the Russian people to bait Russia into doing something and then making Russia look like the bad guy. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not a moron. Okay, I don't think that just because there's a fight going on that the person who's doing the punching is the bad guy. What did the person who was getting punched do to antagonize the other person? Did he steal his wallet? Did he talk about his girlfriend? Did he spit on him before I got there? I don't know, right? What we see now is Russia punching. What we don't see is 30 years of economic, political, and espionage attacks on the Russian people. What we've got here, I'm moving on. I'm moving through this because I don't want to go on a rant, and Miss Cherie has been painfully silent this whole time. We'll get her thoughts here in just a sec. But what you see here, this is the election that you had in 2010, 2014. This is a country that is divided. Okay, all of the areas that are blue are Russian. Do you see a similarity between that map and the one I just showed you? That map, this map. which one is better, this one or this one, right? I'm like an eye doctor now. The areas that are blue are the areas that will become Russian, that already support Russia, that the Russians will keep after this, and they will say, Russia's aggressive, it's annexing territory. No, they're not. This is Russian territory. Just because Putin didn't control it before doesn't mean that it's not Russian, okay? I'm big on national self-determination. I'm crazy like that. It's the one thing that I think that President Wilson actually got right, is that national self-determination is very important. And you can't walk in and say, oh, well, national self-determination is only correct when I say it's correct, says the globalist American empire, limp-wristed diplomat.
Which is exactly what they do, and that you saw that with Brexit, where they're like, "Oh, we're going to hold a referendum," and they get the results back, and people vote to leave, and they're like, "All right, we'll just kick this can down the road for 2 years, and then do like a soft leave of the EU that doesn't have any meaningful, departure other than in name." And then it was the same thing as well with what's that region in Spain? Starts with the C. It's like the only productive. Yeah, Catalonia. I was thinking Catalonia. But yeah, it's like the only productive part of the country, and those people are historically separatists. And so they were like, you know what, we want to hold a referendum too. And the Spanish were like, we're not even going to let you make it that far. And I'm pretty sure they just arrested all the leaders. And that was the end of that. They didn't even get to the referendum part. And it was like, what happens when the right of people, to exercise self-determination conflicts with the quote unquote sovereignty of the state. In reality, it's just threatening the power of the overarching regime of whatever the nation is, whether it's UK or Spanish or American governments. But basically, if you try to secede, it's like, we'll either ignore you or we'll kill you. But there's no part of this where you walk away unscathed.
Right. Yeah, your examples reminded me of Ireland's vote. Ireland, they had a referendum to see if they would join the European Union. The Irish voted no. They didn't want to join the European Union. And then they had a re-vote after they had their new ideas. Go back to 2008 when the banking collapse happened, and the bankster criminals came and they said, the taxpayer needs to bail us out. You senators that we bought, you need to pay for it. And the senators and the House of Representatives, to their credit, they voted no, we will not bail you out. Then they had a re-vote after they met to talk. I mean, this. If you think that democracy is a thing at all anywhere on planet Earth, your head is too soft to go outside or play contact sports. Okay. There is no such thing as will of the people. There are very few governments out there that actually represent their people. I would say maybe Hungary, maybe Poland, maybe Russia, but we don't know, right? No, I don't know about Switzerland. Switzerland,
I don't know either.
Has a lot of problems right now that we're not even going to get into. Moving on here, because again, we're just going through the data points. If you remember, I'm talking to the boomer cons here. I'm talking to the people who are like, Russia bad, because I remember Russia being bad, right? Yeah. The people who, do you remember Trump getting impeached? Trump was impeached in part because he was investigating how Joe Biden and his family was connected to the illegitimate government that had appeared in Ukraine, right? I mean, he was impeached specifically for looking into that. And if you're a Trump supporter and you want to pray for Ukraine, in quotes, because the Ukrainian people desperately need prayers, they need prayers for an immediate ceasefire probably on Russian terms, because that's realpolitik. It's not what I want necessarily. It's the way that the world actually freaking works in non-Barbie world. But, if you support Trump, right? If you are on the right, if you support nationalism, if you want to defend borders, if you want any of this stuff, you can't support what's going on in Ukraine. You can't support the globalist American empire's attempt to start a forever war there. It doesn't make any sense. Examine your own positions. FFS, right? These guys go all the way back. We heard, 10% for the big guy. Ha ha ha. What was that about? That was about kickbacks from the Ukrainian government to Joe Biden himself. That's not a theory. That's not like something that we think. That's not, oh, Donald Trump might have done weird things with Russian prostitutes, but not really. Ha ha ha. That's legitimately what actually happened. Okay. So, okay, I'm going to move on, if I may. Miss Cherie, you have been awfully quiet. What say you?
Um, I'm not very tech savvy, but I hope that anybody that is listening could clip all your rants and send them out because they need to be said and shared.
And if nobody does, I threaten to do that myself. um, yeah. Wow. Somebody in the chat, Captain Marty Spock, I believe I know who that is, mentioned chicken Kiev, and which, by the way, is one of the best foods on planet Earth. If you have never eaten chicken Kiev, I urge you to go down to your local Russian restaurant, patronize them. God knows they're going to need the help. They probably have bricks through their windows now, and order a chicken Kiev, or go to a Ukrainian restaurant and order chicken Kiev. It is a really good piece of food. Now I'm hungry. Darn you, Captain Marty Spock. So now we have this situation, as we've talked about before, where people like us, people like Miss Cherie, people like Templar, people like Commander Culture, people like you who are listening have been told for how many years upon years upon years upon years that you are what's wrong with society. You are a problem. You don't go along with the narrative. Screw you. You deserve to die. You deserve to wither and disappear into history. Didn't Oprah even say that like we should die? Something like that. And now they get themselves into a pickle attacking a powerful, sovereign, nuclear-armed country, and they say, oh no, Russia and China are acting crazy because of our actions and our weakness. We need you to join your army. But I don't even bother to say no. I just say, you're stupid. There's other cartoons where somebody said, where this guy has replied, no, I disagree completely with you, and I hope that they kill you. and I wouldn't dissociate myself from that comment, right?
My favorite thing is the military, kicking out all the unvaccinated people, and then basically all the NPCs on Twitter demanding the vaccinated be the ones that go fight and die in some World War III or something like that. It's just like,
you just kicked us out.
How do you live with these people? Yeah. It's like,
how do they live with themselves? How do they tie their shoes? How do they drink water without drowning?
But that's the difference between us and them is like, I actually don't care how they tie their shoes and whether or not, they can drink water without drowning, because that's almost like a natural selection to take care of itself. The problem is they care about how we live our lives, and it's not good enough that in the COVID thing kind of exemplifies this the best. But you cannot just make decisions for yourself. They want to be able to make decisions for us, and it's such a dangerous ideology to have. That you're going to kick people's doors in and dictate how they're going to live their lives, and then in this instance, it's we gotta support Ukraine and everything, and you really just don't have the option of remaining neutral or just not wanting to get involved in the first place. And it's weird because it's like, if I live in America, or if I live in the UK, or if I live in Japan, what do I care if Russia takes over Ukraine? And as far as as anyone on the planet is concerned, they're like, these are basically the same people. Like, really, what's the difference? It's like the difference between a Japanese and a mainland and Okinawa or something like that. It's like,
yeah, well, I mean, it's even worse than that. And I don't mean to discount what you're saying, but it's like we standing over here minding our own business without knowing it materially benefit from Russia and Ukraine being at peace. However that works. I learned the other day that the United States gets 15% of its petroleum products from Russia. I had no idea that we got that much from Russia. So now we've just cut off our nose to spite our face. No trading with Russia. 70% of all fertilizer in the world comes from either the Ukraine or Russia. I had no idea. And if those countries are not able to export, that is going to lead to a catastrophic collapse in food production, and so without even knowing it, right, we benefit immensely from these guys being at peace. Whether Russia controls all of Ukraine or whether Ukraine is a sovereign country maintaining its own independent middle course, we benefit from that. But yeah, it's on the whole other side of the world. You know, these people who have been like this meme here shows, these people who have been screeching at the top of their lungs that we have to give up every single right that we have as sovereign individuals, including medical freedom and personal choice and religious freedom, says, to save one life or because they don't want to kill grandma. Now they're ready to go to war. They want to. They're like, I've heard, and you've probably heard this. We should start a no-fly zone. Do they even know what the hell that means? That
No.
means a declaration of aerial warfare against a country that has much better air defense artillery than the West, a country that has many, many more functional fighter planes, air superiority planes than the West. It's stupid. Who are these people, and how do they not choke on their own toothbrush? I am constantly amazed by this kind of stuff. Here we go. Here's the F-35 Thunderjug, the world's stupidest airplane, and also I will add the loudest. If you've ever had one go over your house, you're now deaf. Congratulations. It's insane because it's a stubby little short thing, smaller than an F-18. And you can hear it from 10,000 miles away. It can't bomb properly. It can't fly properly. And that's supposed to be our new generation aerial air superiority fighter. Whereas the Russians have had no such problem putting high quality airframes into their squadrons. But I mean, so what is our military? And I mean this. I mean no offense to the hard driving military people among us, but the military is gay. Okay, they suck. The military is terrible. The military, and I will tell you this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it is essentially a vanishingly small group of special operations groups with the world's most enormous logistics tail dragging behind it, supporting every kind of degenerate, idiot, weakling, loser. It's a social program, basically.
It is. And they really want to have their cake and eat it too, where they stand up and say idiotic things like diversity is our strength, and then they host their women's months and their Black History months, and they're basically and obviously you got the gay pride flag here, and they basically prop up every possible agenda that could make the military weaker, that could blunt its sharpness, basically render it non-lethal, and they push all those agendas within the own institution, and then they hold up, like you said, this core of a special operations forces community that actually is able to accomplish limited and really highly successful, honestly, with the number of personnel that they have. But special forces is not something that you could replace overnight, and they're also not something that you can really win a conventional war with. They're useful for our purposes today, which is basically being at war everywhere all the time while simultaneously not being at war at all. And what I mean by that is, the United States has military bases in basically every country in the world except Russia. And part of our power projection is not rolling tanks down the main street of whatever country that we're in, but rather using more limited precision strikes to suffocate and snuff out problems before they even start. And so you do have a highly lethal, highly effective core of operators that are insulated from all of these degenerate and degrading agendas. And then you have the broader military, which makes up 90% of the military population, that's basically not just passively a victim of these agendas, but is essentially forced to actively participate in their own destruction. It's almost as if people who are the most mentally ill, the weakest, the dumbest, those are the ones who are propped up on a pedestal. On top of that, COVID was a great litmus test for the military to see who was going to be a good, obedient lapdog and who was going to think for themselves. And once they identified everyone who was thinking for themselves and was hesitant to either get the vaccine or outright refuse, Now all those people are gone, and so now they have a bunch of, like they would want with civilians, now they have a bunch of military members that are fat, dumb, lazy, gay, and also very obedient. And so
Which is a wonderful combination to have in a premier fighting force.
Yeah. But the point of all of this is that the military has had success, and it's still a very powerful entity. If you look at Iraq and stack just by sheer numbers, if you're looking at aircraft carriers, we have the United States has 13 aircraft carriers, and that's really, those are the larger super carriers, and that's as many as the rest of the world combined. And by that metric alone, the kind of power projection that you have available there is significant. So I don't want to understate the destructive force and destructive capabilities that the United States still has at their disposal, because it is significant. And I would be worried if I were America's enemies. At the same time, in order to beat America in a war, you don't even need to fight them. You don't even need to see them on the battlefield. All you have to do is really take the Chinese approach and wait, because this thing it's not getting any more lethal. In fact, it's getting significantly less lethal. And Russia knows that by intervening militarily, the United States can't really afford to respond in kind, because that's not in their playbook. They're the self-proclaimed democracy and everything, so we can't necessarily just roll tanks straight into Ukraine and face their every T-90 off with the M1A1 Abrams. And it puts the U.S. in somewhat of a conundrum. But the point is that the U.S. is still lethal, but it represents what you see in front of you here. And you've seen many posts about people bemoaning the potential loss of gay rights in Ukraine if Russia is to take over. It's a very similar thing with Afghanistan, and it had the same belligerents in Afghanistan. You had right-wing nationalists in America rooting for the Taliban against America. Why? Because the people who lost in Afghanistan were not the American people. It was the American government. It was the American regime. And as you degrade the power of the American regime, that's a good thing for the oppressed American people who exist in the country. And so now it's functionally the same thing. They're kicking out feminism. They're kicking out homosexuality. They're kicking out degeneracy. What are the Taliban doing? They're reinstating Sharia law. Nobody is a proponent of Sharia law in America, any actual American, but they love to see their own oppressors, namely the globalist American empire, losing ground. And you see the same thing in Ukraine, where at least Putin, even more so than Taliban, represents an Orthodox Christian salient, and that I would absolutely take over what you see in front of you here.
Yeah, and so I agree with that. I'm gonna I'm gonna disagree with my co-host here a little bit, so we get into some debate. We were wondering when we would hit this. I believe that the United States military, as it currently is comprised, is a paper tiger. I think that it is pathetic. I think that it's weak through and through, like a termite-ridden structure. It might look like it's solid on the outside, but it's not. Let me explain. So we can look at a couple of different things. The first one is the easiest to address, and that's those aircraft carriers. Without getting too bogged down in history, we all know that battleships didn't make it very far in World War II because they were obsolete. The aircraft carrier is an obsolete platform. And more to the point, we know exactly why it's obsolete. Any near peer, not even just a peer, because the United States really doesn't have a peer, at least as far as we've seen in kinetic warfare, although that will change rapidly at some point, that has satellites and ballistic missiles. So that could even be North Korea, could sink any American aircraft carrier anywhere on the globe. Okay, all they have to do is point a laser beam on the deck of that aircraft carrier and then launch a strategic ballistic missile that can hit anywhere within 400 meters of that laser point, right? And that aircraft carrier is sunk, destroyed completely with all hands on deck. That's called a kinetic kill vehicle. where you basically just drop a rod. They call it a rod from God. Literally, it's a fun thing to say, but that just drops out of outer space. It doesn't have to have explosives. It doesn't have to be nuclear. It's literally a tungsten core or a titanium core that just falls out of outer space right on top of the deck of that aircraft carrier or anywhere near it, that creates a large enough crater like a meteorite, and that's the end of that aircraft carrier. Within minutes of full-scale hostilities, there's a very large possibility that the United States could lose 2 or 3 aircraft carriers to any power that's willing to do that, to kill that many Americans at sea. Our Aegis systems that are designed to shoot down those missiles are ineffective. The Patriot missiles, which are designed to shoot down those systems, are antiquated. Most American warships carry barely any defensive mechanisms at all, and so including against submarines and certainly against ballistic missiles that are coming in. That's the end of our sea power threat. The only way that the United States is successful in projecting air power is if they have complete air superiority, which is a non-starter at this point. The Russian air defense artillery has hypersonic missiles that are better than anything we've ever seen, and they can create an umbrella of air defense that can shoot down any airplane and almost any missile that's coming into its territory. And we've seen this in Syria, where the Russians have been operating these air defense systems, and Israeli missiles, these are very, very fast, much faster than airplanes, are being destroyed and not even making it into Syrian territory anymore. They're just being destroyed all over the place. Okay. And so, give me a sec here. So there's that, right? Now you look at, well, what's America's ability to project? Well, we can't project. Without airplanes, we can't project. We have drones.
What if you avoided getting into the weeds of the capabilities and limitations of the military items themselves, and kind of took a step back? Because, on the onset of any war, there's going to be like growing pains. The Allies didn't account the utility of a machine gun at the onset of World War One, and then you get the Battle of the Somme, where the British, having previously conquered the whole world by getting into lines and marching at their enemy, now get cut down with this fancy new weapon. And
right, and that's
obviously you learn and you adapt. And at the end of the day, though, it ends up being, at least in these wars of attrition, which you could almost expect that these wars would be, the country that is able to fund and produce its war effort, outpacing the enemy, they're the ones who eventually come out on top.
I'm glad you mentioned that. But before I address that, I also want to say, our ability to project is non-existent, right? We have almost no rocket launcher artillery, very, very, very little. We have very few tanks. We couldn't put tanks in Ukraine, even if we wanted to put tanks in Ukraine, like you said, and go down the street, because we have so very few armored brigades. Right. I'm not talking in position. I'm talking in existence. We use Tomahawk missiles, which were cutting edge when I was a little kid. And I'm not very old, but we were talking today, and it was like I was in college, when Templar was born. Right. These are extremely old weapon systems that we have, and anybody could shoot them down. You could shoot them down with a subsonic airplane. The Tomahawk missiles. We don't have Pershing batteries all over the place, which are the medium range ballistic missiles. We don't have anything. The Russians have all kinds of stuff, including hypersonic missiles, including medium range ballistic missiles that could saturate any target within thousands of kilometers that they wanted to. So now getting back to that, to the British example, yes, but here's the thing: it wouldn't be a war of attrition. It would be a war of attrition in a sense, because everything is attrited, but if you only have 13 aircraft carriers, that's very different than having millions of British soldiers. Because if you lose 50,000 British soldiers, you can just replace them with 50,000 more British soldiers. When you have 13 aircraft carriers and you lose 4, you're not going to be putting the rest of those in harm's way. You're going to be hiding them anywhere you can, under a jungle canopy in Panama or something. Right.
Yeah, I think we're still thinking in conventional war terms, though, because right now we're seeing like the biggest embargo of a country that we've ever seen since America did it to Japan prior to World War II. And yes, that is important in the context of like, oh, these are the kinds of non-kinetic actions that lead to kinetic things. So
Well,
everyone should be aware of that, by the way. But
yeah,
it
yeah.
is a means of fighting war that I think it's almost more effective nowadays because of our dependency on technology and each other and global trade, that our ability to cripple a nation doesn't even involve bombs anymore. We're not even talking about aircraft carriers. We're talking about revoking their access to the SWIFT system, and then having, and it's this disgusting hand-in-hand cooperation between the largest corporations on the planet and the globalist American empire. And I think with those combined, you're going to have effects more deadly than an atomic bomb.
Yes, but also no. Again, we sort of disagree, because it's not like an atomic bomb. What it's like is poison gas. Okay, and poison gas. If you understand the difference, right? Because poison gas is used in a tactical situation, and frequently it's just as dangerous to your own side as it is to your enemies. If it blows back on you, you're in just as bad of a situation as your enemy. Here's the thing. Here's why. Again, just for the peace and prosperity of the American people, this war in Ukraine has to stop immediately, because the morons, the imbeciles, the half-witted stooges that are running whatever passes for war policy here have just literally lopped off both legs of the United States and are dancing around doing rhythmic gymnastics with the tourniquet instead of applying it to their now severed legs. The SWIFT system is one of the few things that gives the American dollar hegemony. The only way that America can strike out at their enemies, the way that you suggested, is if the dollar retains its hegemony. And by cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system, a very intelligent moron on the internet who I was corresponding, I guess you could say, with, pointed out, he said, ha ha ha, Russia's being cut off from everything. Let's see how well they can do. The Soviet Union was cut off from everything and they fell apart. Ha ha ha. Soviet Union the same as Russia. Ha ha ha. And I said, hey, dipshit, who is Russia's largest trading partner? And who does Russia share the largest border with? And by the way, while you're answering those two questions, who's the largest economy on planet Earth? Okay, so the Russians have their ace in the hole as their biggest trading partner. They're not losing anything. Anything they need, from microchips to rubber tires to food, is going to come through China, because everyone's still trading with China. Now, if what are the Russians trading with China? They're not trading U.S. dollars. They can't trade U.S. dollars because they've been cut off from the system. They've been embargoed. So they're trading in cryptocurrencies. They're trading in gold. They're trading in barter. And they're trading in local currencies, the yuan.
You think the people in the U.S. government didn't account for this? Because I don't. I've seen people talking about how the fact that our foreign policy has basically pushed Russia and China together on the same side in such a way that not only like mutually benefits them, but basically forces them to cooperate in such a way that they could actually collectively contest U.S. Hegemony over the whole planet.
They can, and it's
there's a great one in the U.S. government's thinking.
They're fucking idiots. One of the greatest diplomatic historians in American history. I'm a diplomatic historian and a military historian. Is a guy named William Appleman Williams, and his magnum opus is a book called "The Tragedy of American Diplomacy," where he lays out how every single decision that America has ever made diplomatically has been stupid, short-sighted, and weakened America substantially in every single way. And this is not just a continuation of this. This is going into orbit, right? They didn't think about this at all. It's not that they haven't had people telling them. There's an economic theorist by the name of Jim Rickards who's been invited time and time again into economic war games, financial war games within the Pentagon and then the War College. And every single time, him and his little team has defeated the United States government, the United States Treasury, the United States State Department, the United States military in economic and financial war. Very, 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 very simply, using things not half as complex as what either China or Russia are currently holding over the head of the United States, like the sword of Damocles, right? Dollar hegemony is hanging by such a minute, imperceptible thread that it's a miracle that it even still has any legs. Russia and China, like you said, may not have to do anything at all. And by the way, one of the most massive tragedies of the 21st century has been the globalist American empire shoving the Russians bodily into the arms of China. Russia and China are historical antagonists. They have never, ever, ever gotten along, including when they were both communists. They were more likely to go to war with each other during the Cold War than they were to go to war with the United States, right? The genius of Richard Nixon was getting China to be used as an American diplomatic battering ram against Russia. And we have literally reversed that battering ram on ourselves and slammed ourselves in the stomach by pushing the Russians, who for 30 freaking years, since 1991 and 92, wanted desperately to be America's friend. They loved our blue jeans. They loved our McDonald's. They wanted to sell us oil. They wanted us to sell them records. They thought we were really cool. And what did we do? We punched them in the face, poked them in the eye. They're similar to us. They're a certain kind of European. And so the back to the point, the U.S. dollar hegemony is about to crater. It's about to fall apart. The petrodollar is in extreme peril. People are talking about the DEFCON clock and all of this stuff. What the problem is the American dollar system, and that'll take down everything with it. I'll mention, by cutting off the Russians from the SWIFT system, how the Russians have never cut the Europeans off from gas. They have continued to try, even through this war, to sell gas and oil to the European people, who are now freezing their butts off as their energy reserves drop below 5% of capacity, right? The Russians are like, we'll continue to sell you this stuff. And the German government's like, we'll continue to buy it. But guess what? Now that Russia's been disconnected from the SWIFT system, the Europeans can't pay for it. So guess who's going to suffer? Is it the Ukrainians? Yeah. Is it the Russians? No, because they have more oil and gas than they can possibly need. Is it the Chinese? No, because they're going to buy all that oil that would go to Europe at half price. It's the European people who are going to suffer. Those same stupid, moronic, Euro trash people, or brainwashed former Soviet subjects who are sitting there, we support Ukraine, not realizing that they're literally stuffing their head into the Russian bear's jaws at the same time as freezing the rest of their body off. Right? Because their governments and their companies have no way of paying the Russians now. Gee, good one, Team America. You just destroyed the economies of all of your allies. Right? That's what we've done. That's what our economic war has done. Any attempt to even act out only causes greater pain on ourselves and on our strategic position.
And you don't think
it is extreme
some, 4D
folly.
chess move where
By these
at the
idiots?
end of the day, where I don't know. I mean, like, no. I can only think basically by leveling the playing field between Western allies and China and Russia, and basically creating a new superpower contest. Yes. Maybe in the light of like elections or something, they're trying to keep people distracted from the issues at home, or basically try to get native populations to stop them from, doing things like trucker protests and whatnot, in the name of, hey, we're on the brink of war. We got to set our differences aside.
Of course they're doing that. Of course they're doing that. But what's a bigger threat? A trucker protest in Ottawa or the collapse of the U.S. dollar Bretton Woods petrodollar system? When that happens, all hell breaks loose. You don't know. I can't imagine the half of what will happen when a U.S. dollar buys nothing. Right?
Yeah, I'm not ready for that. That's for sure.
Nobody's ready for that. And that's why it's so freaking stupid. Oh, good old Chip Hurtson to say, yes, I am slightly incensed. This just has me so fit to be tied because it's so incredibly stupid. These people are genocidal. We know that they want to kill Russians. We also know by extension and logical application that they want to kill Ukrainians. And they want to kill any other Europeans or people that are
because
stupid enough to
because
stagger
they've
into that
done it
war.
already.
Because
they've
they,
done it
well,
already.
many times. But they also want to kill Americans. They want to kill Canadians who are sitting there. They want this entire system to collapse. The Great Reset isn't just some stupid, ugly fart head named Klaus Schwab sitting up there mouthing off at his carp-like gums. It's like a specific, legitimate plan to collapse the world economy with themselves as some sort of, overlords. But that kind of stuff gets out of control real quick. And speaking of out of control, I am really out of control. We're going to keep moving on here. But this is making the same point as it did before. But, Americans who cower under under government oppression for 2 years urge Ukrainians to die for freedom. And I get so sick of that word. Freedom, 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 freedom. What does freedom mean if you can't eat? Okay. What is freedom? The Russian people are doing very, very well right now. The Russian people who live in Ukraine and have lived in Ukraine have twice the standard of living of the Ukrainian people living in the village next door, right? So because they are connected to Russia, because they're getting the cheaper gasoline, because they're not running around as bedfellows with the globalist American empire, and so what does freedom really mean? Ukraine's not a sovereign free country. The United States is not a sovereign and free country. We're under a soft dictatorship. Canada, we know Canada is under a soft dictatorship. We saw what happened in the American election, that we're under a soft dictatorship.
And if you don't believe that, you should ask yourself why the president of Ukraine is not Ukrainian. Maybe look into what he is, because he's not Ukrainian, and neither is the prime minister.
He's the Jon Stewart. Victoria Nuland handpicked the government of Ukraine. That's not just my fantasy. Okay, she was on tape talking to the American ambassador to the European Union. There was this big thing about it, where she says "F the EU." Right? You can look that up. Look up "F the EU" and find out what the context of that conversation was. She, that lunatic bitch in the Obama administration, was sitting there handpicking the parliament of the Ukraine. Right? That is not a sovereign government. I want to give some historical context here, because this is something I may lose a lot of friends here. Okay. But in World War II, Japan was not the bad guy. All right. The same exact playbook. What does this say? Bankrupting the enemy, the U.S. financial siege of Japan before Pearl Harbor. I beg, I know I have reading lists, but if you have not read this book, buy this book and read it. Okay. It's unbelievable, right? Japan did not want war with the United States. They never wanted war with the United States. They were a trading partner. This is very, 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 very similar to what's happening right now. We had a former ally that we had tensions with, that we should have been working together with, and that we could have been working together with to make a much better world. But instead, we decided, almost de novo, right, to just start attacking this person financially. The United States seized all of Japan's gold that it held in the Federal Reserve and in the U.S. Treasury. Countries then and now keep gold on deposit with the United States, because the United States was seen as being neutral, and the United States was seen as being overseas, so not subject to war risks. And Japan was like, here, America, hold our gold, and then we can use that to trade with other countries. And America said, we don't like your anti-communist stance in China, which is what they were doing. They were trying to decommunize the Chinese countryside in fits and starts, and the way they went about it was absolutely horrible and stupid. But it should not have resulted in the United States seizing the Japanese, basically the SWIFT system, the payment system of the Japanese. And then the Japanese said, well, now we don't have any way to buy oil, so we're going to go to oil-producing countries, specifically the Dutch East Indies, what's now Indonesia, and Mexico, and we said, we will pay you in silk for oil. And America said, Mexico, if you sell them any oil, we will invade you. The United States threatened to invade Mexico in the early 1940s if they traded silk for oil to the Japanese. They threatened to seize Holland's gold. Holland, how much more friendly can you get than Holland? We threatened to seize their gold if they sold oil to the Japanese. And the Dutch said, look, we've already been taken over by the Nazis. Our country is under control. The only sovereign place we have left is the Dutch East Indies. The only industry we have left is oil. We need to raise money. And America said, we don't care if you go impoverished. We don't care if your country disappears forever. if you sell oil to Japan, we will seize everything you own. And they said, but the Japanese are going to seize our territory because it's sitting there completely undefended. Don't you understand that? And America said, ha, 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 la, 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 dee, 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 dee. America will never, or Japan will never do anything. In fact, watch this. We're going to take our entire Pacific fleet, which was always and ever based out of San Diego, and we're going to move it right into the middle of the Pacific Ocean at Pearl Harbor at an undeveloped, relatively undeveloped naval station at the time. And we're going to just see what the Japanese do and go neener, neener, neener all the time while laughing at them for having no oil and for having trusted us with gold. That's what that whole story is about. That's absolutely true. The United States drove Japan into war. Pearl Harbor, I started the beginning by saying Russia was not the aggressor in this situation. Japan was not the aggressor in World War II. I'm talking about the Pacific War with the United States. They have all kinds of beefs with China and Korea, and we're not getting into that right now. But they drove the Japanese into a war, then genocided them by firebombing every single one of their cities and then nuked the hell out of them, right? They're doing the exact same thing. And if you think that that's lost on the Russians, it's not. All Japan wanted to do was sell silk. All Japan wanted to do was sell high-priced luxury items to America and to the rest of the world. And America said, well, you're undercutting us in certain markets, so F you. And they're like, but we're anti-communist. And America said, who cares about communism? Let communism flourish as long as you don't flourish because you're a market competitor, you bastard. And so we got World War II in the Pacific, right? And so we're doing the exact same thing. It's the exact same playbook. We're trying to financially besiege the Russians into provoking them into a war. Now, I would like to think that the Russians are smarter than that, but the United States is not smarter than that. They're going to continue to push. They're going to continue to move things closer to their enemies. They're going to say, "Ooh, look at my queen," on the chessboard, and then act shocked and appalled. And, oh, my God, woe is me. The Lusitania went down with 10,000 tons of munitions on it. How terrible those people were. Oh, my God, the Maine blew up. Who could have possibly done that? Look at the Gulf of Tonkin. Where did those torpedoes come from? I am just shocked that a land-based, impoverished third world guerrilla army like the Viet Cong could have high-tech torpedoes that are all of a sudden attacking our destroyers. It's like, if you don't get it by now, I don't know what to tell you. You're being led down a primrose path. The only logical reaction is to say, my God, I hope this ends very quickly. And my God, I hope that the enemy of my enemy is brought low. That's all I can say. Templar, you keep wanting to jump in and I keep rambling.
No. I was just going to say it's kind of even worse than what you're describing because it's not just the economic sanctions and everything. At this point, Ukraine has essentially opened their borders to anyone around the world willing to come and add to the bloodshed and mire the Russians down.
It's a Spanish Civil War situation, like with the Lincoln Brigade.
Yeah, or Afghanistan, except that wasn't really global volunteers. That was kind of just us pushing arms and money over to the Mujahideen to try to bog them down in Afghanistan. But the point stands, right. There's man and material flowing into Ukraine through every avenue that's still open with the explicit purpose of just spilling as much blood as possible in that country. And like you already said, there's no scenario where Ukraine actually wins this war. The only thing is how bloody is it going to have to get before they capitulate? And so long as you have people all over the world basically just egging this on, stoking the fire, there's going to be a lot more bloodshed for nothing. And it's really unfortunate when people say pray for Ukraine. They're not talking about praying for the Ukrainian people, because the best thing that could happen to the Ukrainian people is that this war ends now. What they're really hoping for is just that Ukraine, as this state that has existed for all of 30 years and in people's imaginations, that this entity with imaginary borders drawn just continues to sputter along in existence. And so long as it does, and so long as there's people, man and material flowing into the country, and people fighting, and maybe you're going to see a guerrilla war, but it just continue to spiral downward. But the end result is just going to be more blood spilt, and everyone praying for Ukraine, who's praying not for the end of war, but for the quote unquote sovereignty, the sovereignty of the nation to remain. They're really asking for just more blood to be spilled. And it would also be nice if people in America cared as much about U.S. sovereignty as they did about Ukrainian sovereignty, some country like that they had never even heard of prior to a couple months ago. That would be nice. And it really goes to show at the end of the day that most people are in fact sheep. They'll take their programming from social media and mainstream media, and whether it's Ukraine or COVID or plastic straws or Amazon forest fires or BLM or the bees going extinct or climate change. I think all of you understand the similarities between all of these things, and it's just issues that people are told that they need to care about. And it's absolutely astonishing how lockstep, and you would think it literally is just computer programming being uploaded into people's brains and then deleted and filled with something else in the very next month. But that's essentially what this is. And no normal person would actually care about this. They only do because they're told to, and they care about it for the wrong reasons in the wrong way.
That they can't, like, I would listen to anybody who could explain the other side of the arguments that I'm making. I would even listen to anybody who could point out the relevant countries on a map, but none of these people can. They can't. And so it's like, but in the our selected world, they have these numbers, and so we stumble on towards Armageddon.
And there's no political ties that even obligate the U.S. or any Western country to basically go to war on behalf of Ukraine.
But that's what they were. That's why they were trying to extend NATO to them. And because so that way it would. We've got this thing. And I will say this though. The parallels between the Spanish Civil War, between Afghanistan, are alarming. However, I want to point something out geography-wise. Ukraine, for absolutely by and large, there are some small exceptions, but just 90% of Ukraine is a giant flat wheat field. Okay, if you've ever been to Kansas, that is what Ukraine looks like. If you've ever been to Nebraska, that is what Ukraine looks like. So the ability to wage a partisan guerrilla war from an international, Lincoln brigade of motley jackasses trying to kill as many Russians as they can and get as many Ukrainians killed as possible. By the way, the Maidan uprisings really got going when CIA-backed snipers started shooting supporters of regime change in the square in Ukraine. So they're perfectly willing to kill their own people, right? And just cause a whole bunch of bloodshed. But you can't really do that in what's called tank country. You can't really have a guerrilla uprising. It's like it just doesn't work. Ask the Ukrainians how it worked when they tried to rise up against Soviet oppression. Ask the Ukrainians how it went when they decided that they'd had enough of the Nazis occupying their country or their space, or the Imperial Germans during after World War I. Like you can't really do that. So I hold out hope that the geography itself will lend itself to not a Spanish Civil War situation, not a Afghanistan situation.
I think they're going to get bogged down in the urban areas. I think.
Well,
they're going to get some of their bloodshed.
Possibly. The Russian strategy seems to be simply surrounding the cities. They leave small corridors for people who want to leave and for supplies of medicine and food to get in. And they are not invading, by and large, the urban centers or even attacking them. They're trying to avoid civilian casualties from all I've seen. And so I don't know how that plays into the long-term strategy, but it tells me that they don't want any sort of civilian casualties or anything like that.
I'm also concerned about their logistics supply trains, because they're gonna, so long as they have forces there, they're gonna need to sustain them, and those are big vulnerabilities.
That's true, but
a lot of opportunity for guerrilla warfare there.
There is, but here's the other thing. Remember those maps, right? Overwhelmingly, the territory. Actually, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to actually show it. The territory where the Russians are is primarily occupied by Russian supporters. Or there's a plurality of Russian supporters, even in these areas where it's orange. The pro-Europe party only led by 20% plus only, right? So there are tons and tons of Russian supporters in these areas. It's not like they're operating in enemy territory. It's not. The vast majority of Ukrainian civilians have no antipathy whatsoever towards Russians. And to the extent that they're neutral, many of them realize that if Russia actually takes over wherever they happen to live, their standard of living will skyrocket to the low level that the Russian people actually enjoy, but which is much, much higher than impoverished Ukraine. So you don't have this sort of, werewolves coming out of the fields and stuff going after all of them. Because, I mean, for example, you've seen they've tried to spark this. You saw that long logistics train that was outside Kiev that was, bogged down. That was never attacked.
People to kill that.
Oh yeah, they were begging people. But I mean, I'm not even talking air power. Not one person with a sniper rifle or an RPG, to my knowledge, went to where that obvious location was and did anything about it for the 24 hours or so that it was bogged down or locked up. Right? This is not a hostile population that the Russians are moving in. It's not a friendly population, but it's a population that's saying, if it goes either way, it's going to work out for me. So I'm just going to kind of stand back and I'm not going to get myself killed. And that leads to, like we said, the Ukrainians don't have an option to win, but the Russians do. And so that militates in favor of a quicker Russian victory. That's how I look at it, because I'm ever the optimist. But I'll tell you this was a funny meme. I was cracking up to death over it, wasn't I, Sherry?
I wish I had it on video.
Oh my God, I'm glad you don't. I almost busted a lung. But somehow I just love this meme. It's a weakness. But like, okay, so we know that they were handing out free weapons on the streets of Ukraine. Well, now we find out, of course, when you hand out random weapons, you get tons of random crime. And apparently Kiev has devolved in sort of some sort of internal chaotic situation where you have gangsters and looters and criminal warlords and stuff all getting access now to free weapons, which, by the way, will 5 years down the road show up on the black market in Germany and Sweden and France and places like that.
Where do you think those came from?
Just the old Soviet stores, probably. The storage depots and stuff. Like, you can go, go online.
There? Was it the Ukrainian government, or
they've just always been there. They've just been waiting for the time. You can go online and you can buy Soviet era bolt action rifles or Soviet action AK-47s that are still in the original boxes from like the 60s or the 70s or whatever. And that's where these came from. There's just millions of these old Soviet weapons just sort of sitting there doing nothing. And so they started handing these things out. Of course, they weren't handing out bullets with them, but that's a famous Russian thing. Hey, your bayonet works just as good as bullet. But in reality, it doesn't. But so this is the kind of chaos that they're hoping to foment. Why would you just be handing out random AK-47s unless you wanted chaos and death, right? Okay, so moving on. I don't want to. I don't know how many more slides we've got. I don't want to bore anybody. I hope people are enjoying this or getting something out of it. We're going to kind of try to move it into a bigger picture here, because now we see the same people that are saying, well, that's Putin guy, it's getting out of control. And they're the ones that are the authoritarians. They're the ones that are jabbed up to the nines. And that's another reason, by the way, that I think that the United States military is not a fighting force, because they're all jabbed to hell. And as soon as they start acting in a kinetic fashion, like say you get amped up because you're in a combat situation, at least as amped up as like a soccer player, or a track star or something like that. Yeah, you're just going to keel over. You're in air combat with a Russian MiG-29 and your heart rate goes up, and all of a sudden, you don't need the Chinese to hack the microchip that came from China, which is likely to happen in any air war.
Yeah.
You're just gonna keel over anyway. So the narrative seems to be collapsing, right? And that's what I hope is happening. More and more people are going to see through the lies. We're not a black pill organization here at Commander Culture TV. We are a red pill organization. Things are bad for the bad guys. Evil never prospers. I'm sorry, evil never wins in the end, even if it prospers in the short term. So, all of these people who have been safely and effectively clot-shotted, who are on the bad side, they're in big trouble. The people who have decided, oh, we're going to try to control the world by destroying the economic foundations upon which that world sits, are in really big trouble.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I feel like since, even post World War II or even before World War II, but really since World War II, it's kind of been the same people doing these same things since that time, and it's like, why hasn't the chickens come home to roost? Like we've seen nations rise and fall. You would think maybe after the USSR fell, the Russian people, after having been victims of this evil regime, would basically out the people that were responsible for it, and you see similar resistance among
Mhm.
basically any country that was under the thumb of these regimes. Like, if you're
Well,
confident in that, we'll see. The people who are getting the shot or pushing the shot either being held accountable or being victims of their own stupidity and their own destruction and degradation. I mean, we haven't seen that in the last 100 years. Are we going to see it in the next one?
yes, I think we will, and I think that there's two things going on. One of them is the what we'll call the triumph of Edward Bernays, right? The triumph of mass media control, of mass psychological programming, of mass propaganda. But at the same time, historically, in the modern world, which goes back to maybe the American Revolution, there have been waves of ideology driven and then realpolitik driven. So you have the revolutions of 1848. Then you have the Congress of Vienna and Otto von Bismarck. Then you have the communist revolutions. Then you have the realpolitik of the 1930s. Then you have the ideology of the Cold War, and that started to get locked in because of mass media control and the ways of controlling people's minds and thoughts and preferences through psychological means. And so what that did is that slowed the process down of shifting between ideology driven politics. The Soviet Union were a bunch of idiots too. They couldn't get out of their own way to figure out how to actually beat the United States in a functional way. And the same with the United States. It's just we happen to outlast them because our economic system was more rigid and rigorous. But what we're seeing now, I believe, is a return to a realpolitik world, the world of Otto von Bismarck. And we saw what happened when Otto von Bismarck expanded the German the Prussian Empire into a unified Germany, or what Garibaldi did from disparate Italian states into a unified place, or what, for
So
example,
you're just
Abraham
talking about
Lincoln
power
did in
consolidation?
pardon.
Are you just talking about power consolidation?
No, I'm talking about an approach to geopolitics and to diplomacy that is fundamentally different from an ideology driven motivation. So in the past, so right now they're saying freedom, democracy, da da da, but everyone knows that means absolutely nothing. This is a Democrat right here that we're looking at. This is a liberal. This is somebody who ostensibly stands for absolute almost anarchic levels of freedom. Yet all of their actions and the politicians and leaders that they support are against those sort of things. And so the contradictions in the system, and the people who are called fascists, and like us, right, are the people who believe in and propagate the most freedom-based civilization, societies, and cultures that could exist. And so everyone's eyeballs do what this German news anchor's eyeballs are doing, as they try to figure out, ideology isn't a way to structure a government, to run a foreign policy, to organize an economy. All that you can do is brutal reality, brutal realpolitik, right? National interest über alles, right? It has nothing to do, and that's the slide that we first showed with that cartoon, right? But fascists are lining up right alongside communists for national self-interest. The globalist American empire and all various manner of unholy people are lining up against those sort of things, right? But they're functioning on a gasoline that no longer powers the engine of politics. Okay, so we're entering into a new era. That's why Russia will win, because Russia it operates on a basis of reality. The Russians hate the Chinese. Okay, the Chinese covet all of Russian Siberia, right? Desperately, they will take it someday, or they will attempt to. Both sides know that, but what are they doing? They're making an alliance of convenience that could lead to a superpower block of convenience, right? As long as they defeat their enemies, that's really all that matters. The Germans have a choice. The Germans can either freeze to death, or they can buy oil from Russia without any kind of consequences, right? So what are they going to do? Are they going to follow the globalist American empire's flights of fancy and stupid ideas about globalism and freedom and democracy and free trade and trade for everyone when that trade is completely strangled and they're freezing and starving to death? Or are they just going to say, you know what, the Russians are the best people to trade with. We're not crazed like the Lithuanians and the Polish against the Russians. So you know what, we're going to trade with them anyway. And the Japanese will do the same thing. And because ideology no longer has that same grasp, it no longer has that same potency. We're moving into an era of realpolitik. And if you continue to delusionally,
soft people, hard times, hard people cycle.
it's part of that. You could say that because hard people believe in realpolitik. Right.
Yeah.
And soft people say, oh, it's the feeling. And I had this one idea and my professor once said, and oh my God, you're so mean. And that matters not a whit. The Russians do not care. People are like, the Russians are losing the propaganda war. Even people that sort of tacitly support Russia. It doesn't frickin' matter what the propaganda war is. Zelensky and his band of criminals will surrender or flee the country regardless of what the propaganda war says, because the reality on the ground says something else, right? And then as that idea gets pushed forward, look at the trucker rally, right? The propaganda war said all these things about these people, but in the end they won because guess what? They actually occupied the territory. That they had the power, they had the ace in the hole, they controlled the trade system of the country. And so no matter what the globalist American empire wanted, it didn't get it because it was fueled by ideology and the truckers were fueled by reality. Same thing with Russia, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Ms. Cherie, what are your thoughts on all this?
I was just thinking about how there's a certain country that we give like, $104 per second or minute to, I can't remember, but it's said that they're, or it's claimed that they're funding both sides. Kind of like that tug of war. I think there's a flag missing among those.
Yeah, you're talking about Israel probably. And Israel will be the first hilarious victim of a collapse of the US petrodollar system, because then Saudi Arabia will have no reason to either continue to support Israel, which they do, or they will fall to a Wahhabist revolution, which will then lead to a jihad against Israel that's been a very long time coming. And while Israel has won a lot of its wars in the past, it has never won any wars without tacit or substantive U.S. assistance. And they'll be completely overwhelmed and destroyed as the globalist American empire collapses in on itself. Just like this meme here shows, America's already been destroyed. We're just going through the motions till the shooting starts. I think this is talking about like an incipient civil war in the United States, like we almost saw in Canada this last month. But it means everywhere. And we know that as soon as China feels like it has a green light, they're going for Taiwan. It's a good bet that if North Korea thinks they have a green light, they're going to go into South Korea. Pakistan against India, everyone in their surroundings against Israel, Turkey against Greece. Everyone's just sitting there waiting for the gun to go off. And the gun is the collapse of the Bretton Woods petrodollar system that the United States is currently jackhammering, with a frenzy rarely seen outside of meth-fueled mania. So, it's anybody's bet as to what's going to happen, with Israel, whether they're funding both sides or not. They think they're very clever. Oh, they're so smart. Oh, you're so smart. Look at you. You're very good. You're funding both sides. And they're going to both win, and then we're going to be in control of both. And that's simply a fever dream and a fantasy of somebody who's thinking that the branch that they're sawing off, that they're sitting on, is going to fly them away like a witch on a broomstick instead of understand the harsh laws of gravity. So, yeah.
Sounds almost optimistic, actually, in your assessment.
Long term, yeah, because reality always wins. Gravity always wins.
It's just been a long time coming. I'm also afraid by the fact that how long that we've ignored reality means how much.
It's gonna hurt
when the reality.
It's gonna hurt. Well, I mean, it's the Wile E. Coyote thing every single time. If Wile E. Coyote, pretended like he was walking, running across a bridge, across, 2 feet above a little stream, it wouldn't hurt all that much. But Wile E. Coyote's running 10,000 feet above the Grand Canyon. And when he realizes that gravity is actually a thing, it's extremely painful for him, right? And that's the situation that we're in. You can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. And that's the situation where the United States finds itself. And that's the people like us and the so-called leaders, who are nothing but a collection of pathetic idiots. And I mean that in every sense of the word. They're pathetic, they're evil, and they're profoundly stupid, as we've seen. Probably partly by hubris, but also just by the fact that, they may be missing a chromosome or two.
I think you would be exaggerating unless I had historical context. And when you think of some of the Roman emperors and some of the stuff they did, it's actually not out of the realm of possibility for the most powerful and competent superpowers in the world to have the dumbest people that you could ever imagine elected to power. Not even elected, just somehow rise to power.
Right. Yeah. And you can having smart people in as no guarantee that you're going to be successful.
I'm thinking specifically of Caracalla.
Yeah, or you could look at Nero, or you could look at any of these other people. I look, for example, at the Soviet Union. All of the leaders of the Soviet Union were brilliant. They were geniuses, right? They might have been kind of ugly, but they were really, really smart. And that country fell apart like nobody's business. The wheels just came off like a race car that hadn't had the lug nuts tied or something. And here we are being run by absolute drooling morons who are actively destroying the pillars upon which their own power rests. It's hilarious to sit back and watch. I'm the Joker, right? I'm realizing that this thing is already a collapsing structure. It's just how bad is it going to get? Does the Joker get out every time? Not every time. Sometimes he ends up in the rubble dead with his little laughing laugh box. Well, Batman looks over him anyway. And that could be us. But the thing is that in the long term, the people who ignore reality in favor of like blinkered sort of ideology always lose. The ideologues always lose versus the realists. And the realists are always on the right, and the leftists are always on the side of ideology and fiction and make believe and pretend and want it to be, and revolution rather than restoration. I'm getting a little winded here.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at that. I'm like, okay, cool. Say we get a Francisco Franco, and say it even turns out as well insofar as the Spanish Civil War went well. Obviously, the good guys won, but say it turns out that way, and then guess what? Within the century, within people's lifespan, they see the country they just fought a bloody civil war over and won. Go back to its old cucked ways, and the cycle repeats itself.
Well, right. let me offer
and now you see your hero getting his grave, just torn out of the ground because the people who are currently in power hate the fact that he beat their friends.
Yes. Well, here's the thing. We know how to control a population. The evil people in the left have taught us, from Edward Bernays all the way up to the present day. It's very easy to control a population in any way, shape, or form, no matter what your ideology. It's very hard to manage a situation in the real world when you base that real life situation on a fictional narrative. But if you base it in reality, it's much more stable. So if you have a stable situation and you have a government or leadership that manages or curates public opinion in at least an effective a way as the leftists, anarcho, tyrannists do now, then you have the recipe for a long period. I don't want to say perpetuity, but a very long period of right-wing rightist stability. Okay, I will tell you, based on my own assessment, that let's just say in the late 1930s, there was a very strong prospect of that reality coming true, and we'd still be living in it, were it not for a certain combination of events that saw the globalist American empire and the Soviet Union rise instead. Oops. Hope I didn't deafen anyone with that mic tap there. And so it was already almost a close run thing. We're overdue for the fix that was going to come in the 1930s, which would not have been as good as the fix that we'll have now, because we've learned a lot more since then. We're in a much better position with regards to resources, with regards to understanding how societies work, with regards to that sort of thing. So that's what I think. That's a total guess on my part, but it's also a very optimistic appraisal and a realistic one, I think. Because they can deny reality, but reality still exists, and we're the ones who understand how to. Reality is the medium in which we exist. That's why you and I are sitting here talking about Russia not being the aggressor, about Japan not being the aggressor, about the globalist American empire continually attacking Russia, because that's the reality. We don't live in the fiction of the feel-good pray for Ukraine. We don't live in the fiction of, how many likes am I getting on Facebook? We don't live in the fiction of standing around with a bunch of people with stupid signs that don't even get the Ukrainian colors in the right order. We live in the real world, and we're agents of reality, which means that we will win in the end, because reality, like gravity, always wins.
Man, I didn't know I'd be getting all these white pills tonight.
I am full of white pills. I am nothing but a giant white pill. That's why my uniform is white. My helmet is white. My gauntlet fist that I use to punch anarcho-tyrannists repeatedly is white. My jacket, which is studded with the skulls of my enemies, is white. And no matter what race my enemies were, their skulls are also white. So, that's pretty much where we're at today. We start out, it looks bad, but everything they tell you is a lie. When they say that Russia's losing the war, which I see all over the place, Russia's not losing the war. Russia is spectacularly winning the war, even if you take what's known about the tactical and operational situation and apply it to past military operations. It's a fantastic, amazing success. Now, it could certainly bog down. That's our fear, right? But in the end, Russia wins because Russia can't afford to lose. And Putin has said, I will nuke you before I lose. And I would take him at his word. So that's not a white pill. But the white pill is that reality always wins. That's like saying gravity always wins. No, I have a rocket engine. Oh my God. I'm going to totally pull away from that black hole. Well,
And then they
sorry.
run out of fuel.
Well, yeah, when you run out of fuel, guess what happens? Gravity wins. So that I'm going to say that's my closing thoughts for the evening. Templar, I'd like to hear your summary.
Yeah, I would say, try not to lose all of your friends over something like this, the problem, is, from what it sounds like, will essentially solve itself. But you can't really afford to be splitting hairs with, your political allies or your former political allies when your enemies are the globalist American empire. Uh, it's not that it's like semantics and not that it's insignificant, but it's not a significant enough issue to basically make your group less significant and even smaller than it was before, because we're really going to need all the help we can get. And I can promise you, whatever differences that you have with people over the fight in Ukraine, they're not nearly as large as the differences that you have with the people who are likely running your country. Because if they're anything like the president of Ukraine, they probably aren't even of the same tribe as you. So just keep that in mind when all of the hand wringing and atrocity propaganda continues to roll out of that part of the world. Pay no attention to it, and make amends with those people who you might disagree with for whatever reason, because a lot of people are creating enemies out of people on their own side over this, and you really shouldn't be doing that, because there's real enemies that you're not going to be able to. You can talk and you can have conversation and settle issues with people who are on your own side. You can't do that with the people in government who hate you, want to see you dead, and think it's funny.
Thank you for that. Those are wise words. Miss Cherie?
I just want to say, considering all the lying and gaslighting that the mainstream media has done in the last few years and continues to do today, I would just urge people to, read between the lines and think for yourself. And, a lie can get around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. So,
I will say one more thing. If you do have to pick a side, if you're among your friends or you're among your political allies and they're forcing you to take a stance, and you're going to lose friends over it, at least pick the side that the Rothschilds, George Soros, and the State Department are not on.
yes.
If I had to force my hand, and you're being forced to choose between Ukraine and Russia, pick the one that those evil people are not on. So there's your simplest out if you are forced to have to pick a side.
Wonderful. We hope that you enjoyed this chat today. We hope you got some value out of it. If you did, please do us a favor and like it and share it, especially out with as many people as you can, because this is, I think, something that people both on our side and on the other side need to hear. Because like Templar said, we do need to come together. We have much more pressing enemies than one another's disagreements on our lack of knowledge of geopolitics. And so don't burn any bridges. And I'm trying to do the same thing myself, which is why I come on here anonymously instead of going on to social media with my real self. So as Whoopi Goldberg has famously said, this has been a thing between white people. Remember that tomorrow belongs to you and to the stars.